Hey, good morning, everybody. I want to focus on one word in last week's Kriyas HaTorah. The rabbis encourage us that every week we should do Shnayim Mikra V'Echad Targum. Every week we should review the Parsha and read the Psukim along with the Aramaic translation. Because sometimes it takes time to understand what's being read, and you can't really pause while the Baal Koreh is laning, because then you'll miss some important words of Kriyas HaTorah. But there's what, and especially in Sefer Vayikra, where most of it is devoted to the work of the Kohanim and the Korbanos, the various sacrifices. And for better or for worse, sacrifices are not a topic of great interest to many people. Many people may have questions about sacrifices today. It is something that is difficult to understand in the best of circumstances. But there's one particular type of sacrifice that I want to focus on, which has always intrigued me. In last week's parsha, we talked about an olah, a burnt sacrifice. We talked about a chatos, a sin sacrifice. You have to bring an animal to atone, expiate for your sins. Fine. Without going into the whole explanations of what the purpose of korbanos is, that's for a separate discussion. But there's one thing, it's fascinating. The Torah wants to give everybody the opportunity to atone for their sins, rich and poor alike. So what if you can't afford an animal? Can't afford an animal, what do? So there are different levels. You can bring something else. And if you're really, really very poor and you'd like to atone for a sin or offer an offering, you could bring doves, little birds. You bring little birds. So even the poorest person can afford a bird. So you bring a bird to the Beis HaMikdash, and the Kohen does something very, very strange. He doesn't slaughter, in the traditional sense, the bird. We know what shechita is. You take a special knife and you slaughter, you cut the trachea and the windpipe in a very humane way, as humane as it could possibly be. But for a bird, you don't have that. And you have something called malika, which is a very strange word, and nobody really translates it properly. Pinching, what's the word? Nipping, according to the art scroll. What exactly is malika? The Kohen takes the bird, dove in his hand, and he does something called malika. Malika is not really shechita in the traditional sense. What is this malika? I don't know if anybody paused on that word when you were going over the parsha last week, or when you were listening to it in shul. It came up twice in the parsha. What is this malika? The Kohen shall bring it to the mizbeach, umolak es rosha, and he should do malika on the head of this bird, this dove, little bird that you can hold in your hand. Very strange word. And it's interesting that if you do malika outside the Beis HaMikdash, then that's considered an avela. You can't eat it. This process of malika can only be done inside the Beis HaMikdash by the Kohen. Nobody else can do it. No other location. So first of all, I think we have to understand the whole notion of slaughtering. The Torah uses the word v'zavachta, v'shachat, etc. How do we know about shechita? I mean, it's a very, very big topic for rabbis to study. When a person gets smicha, traditionally, they assume he knew all the other halachos. But shechita you had to learn and be tested on very, very carefully, because if you were a rabbi and you're going to a community, people have to eat. And someone has to supervise the shochtim. So you have to learn shechita. And believe me that when your meat doesn't come always wrapped in plastic. It started out as a full-fledged animal, and there's a process, and it's a bloody process. It's a quick process, but if you've ever gone into a slaughterhouse, you'll gain a new respect for the shoftim, for what they do every day, especially for the large animals. But where do you learn the halachos of shechita? Where does it come from? Is it mentioned anywhere in the Torah how to shecht? So just parenthetically, I should mention that shechita is one of those areas which illustrates the power of Torah Shebaal Peh, the oral law. There's a lot of stuff that we do today that is not found in the Torah. Okay, the Torah has one pasuk about shechita. It tells you to shecht many, many times. Kohanim did it all the time. One pasuk says, "V'zavachta ka'asher tzivisichi." You shall slaughter as I have commanded you. You won't find it anywhere in Chumash. It's all Torah Shebaal Peh. The same way, by the way, when it tells you to live in a sukkah, does it tell you how to build a sukkah in the Chumash? Not there. All part of Torah Shebaal Peh. So shechita is one of those areas which are totally dependent. Avelus. There's so many things that are totally dependent on Torah Shebaal Peh. All right. So shechita, in its many, and its shechita is one of the most. It's a very, very complicated area to learn, and not everybody has the manual dexterity to actually be a shochet. But if you're a rabbi in a far-flung community, you have to learn about it because you got to check the shochet's knives. You make sure that they're doing it properly. And there's a lot of learning. It's amazing to me that traditionally somebody would learn in the yeshiva 10, 20, 30 years, needed a job, so his Rosh Yeshiva would test him on Hilchas Shechita, not Hilchas Shabbos, not Hilchas Kriyas HaTorah, not all the other Shechita. That's what you had to learn. So you take off a couple of a year or two from your regular learning. You just study Hilchas Shechita, and then you get your smicha. You go off and be a rabbi in the community. And even today, they've added it now. I mean, when I went to yeshiva, shechita was part of the major curriculum to get smicha. Now they've added Hilchas Shabbos and Hilchas Mikveh and Nidar, but originally you just had shechita. And the smicha says that that person is knowledgeable in Hilchas Shechita. That's what the language of the actual document says shechita. It doesn't say the person knows about anything else. They used to make a joke that in order to get smicha, all you had to learn was Hilchas Shabbos and Hilchas Kriyas HaTorah and Rav Moshe Feinstein's phone number. That was enough. In any event, what is this malika that we talked, that the Torah says that if a person can't afford an animal, you bring a dove for a korban ola, for a korban chatos, and the Kohen molak es rosho. He does this malika on the head of this bird. And we really don't know what malika, I mean, the translation is pinching and nipping. We don't really know what it is. And there's a difference. With a korban ola, with a burnt offering, the head was totally severed from the bird. With a korban chatos, it was like 3/4 severed. Etymologically, very problematic. Targum doesn't even translate it. It's just the Hebrew. Rav Sadia Gaon says you separate the head from the body. Okay. Menachem ben Sruk, a very famous grammarian that Rashi quotes all the time, simply means that malika is a form of shechita for this particular bird. Another famous grammarian, anybody hear the name Dunosh ben Labrat? Dunosh ben Labrat, very, very famous grammarian and paitan. He wrote Doror Yikra, famous Shabbos Zemer. He also wrote the line that we say at a chasna, Devai Haser V'gam Charon. Anyhow, he's a grammarian. And he also says that malika is a form of shechita. Now, shchita requires a knife. So how could malika, which doesn't require a knife, be called shchita? And Rabbeinu Tam and Rishonim get involved in this. But basically, we really are not quite sure. Yes.
I read somewhere that the Kohen uses his thumbnail.
Yes,
to
I'm
sever
coming
the
to
head.
Yes, I'm coming to that. But the Torah doesn't say that. I'm going to come to that. The Torah doesn't tell you exactly what it is. And we find this, as I said, in the Torah Shabbat Peh, in the Gemara. And the Gemara basically tells you what the practice, the word in Zvachim, and it's also in Kulin. And the Kohen, it doesn't say if he's a righty or a lefty. The Kohen takes the bird is held in his hand. And with your fingers, you hold, I guess the bottom two fingers would hold the legs, and the top two fingers would hold the wings. So you have to hold the bird with your four fingers. It requires tremendous manual dexterity. And the thumb, the Kohen had to grow his thumbnail very long. And he had to sharpen it to a razor sharpness. And while you're holding the bird in your hand in a certain way, use your thumb to cut through its head from the back. Cut the spine, and you go either, depending if it's an ola or a chata, either go all the way through or until the trachea. But that's how it was done. Very straight. And this process could only be done by the Kohen in the Beis Hamikdash. Any place else, strafe, nevela. You can't eat it. And this is a very, very unusual type of shchita, if you can call it that. And since a Kohen eats part of what he slaughters, he would eat this bird as well, if it's done properly. And only a Kohen can eat a bird that was slaughtered with this process. Anybody else is considered a vela. Interesting, the Karaites will only allow birds to be slaughtered, meaning chickens as well, through Malika, which is very, again, by the 9th and 10th century already, they kind of rejected this, and they went back to shchita for birds and ducks and so forth. But outside the Beis Hamikdash, Malika was not allowed to be performed. Why Malika as opposed to shchita? There's no explanation in the Gemara or the Midrashim that I could find for the reasoning or symbolism for Malika. You find it later on, but basically Malika is some type of an atonement for various sins. And primarily, though, if you use the psukim and the chumash, it's simply a vehicle for a poor person who can't afford an animal to be able to atone for his sins. That seems to be, but why this particular action is very, very difficult. Some Mefarshim point to a pasuk in Yirmiyahu relating to the word fingernail. Kabbalists talking about sinners who turn their back to God, but that would be everybody, not just a poor person. So I'm not quite sure. Again, it's not specific. The Sefer Achinuch, which tries to give reasons for mitzvos, says that we really don't understand the meaning behind this particular thing. He suggests that the reason that you slaughter from the back of the bird's neck is symbolic that the Jewish people are an am kashei oref. They're a stiff-necked people. We're a stubborn bunch of people. We know that. So that's why you sin, because you're so stubborn. So that's one attempt at trying to understand it. It's done with the hand and not the knife, because a poor person, his needs need to be taken care of. And by doing it quickly with the thumb, I guess the process is hastened and the poor person doesn't have to stand around waiting for the animal to be slaughtered. Usually when you bring an animal, you stand there until the Kohen slaughters it, and then your sin is atoned for. So this way, it's done quicker in consideration of the person. It's also done, by the way, literally at the Mizbeach. You're standing over the altar because you have to pour the blood or whatever you're sacrificing on the altar. And there's not too much blood in a turtle dove. So basically, when he slaughters it, he literally has to squeeze the blood out of it onto the Mizbeach. It's a very unique and unusual type of process, which I guess if you are following the Kriya carefully, jumps out at you. It just jumps out to me anyway. Shimshon Raphael Hirsch tries to find, based on psukim, that how birds get trapped. Basically, the bird is slaughtered in a violent and destructive way, symbolizing a suffering person, in contrast to the relatively, I guess, neat and refined manner in which regular shechita takes place. But if you ever observed regular shechita, it's not very neat and refined either. I mean, I've been there. There's a reason why shachtim wear raincoats and boots, because when you slaughter that cow and it thrashes around, there's blood everywhere. The rainstorm. It's not a very refined process, but the animal is rendered unconscious immediately. But nevertheless, the rest of his body hasn't gotten this message that it's dead, so it's still thrashing. The classical chicken without its head. If you slaughter a chicken, it can still run around for a few minutes because the rest of his body doesn't know that the head is taken off. That's where the expression comes from, running around like a chicken without a head. It takes a while for the message to get to the rest of the body that the head is gone. Okay, so again, whatever little blood there is gets spilled on the Mizbeach. Again, interestingly enough, we know that you're not allowed to use metal implements on the Mizbeach, because metal implements are implements of war, swords, knives, and so forth. And the altar was used to atone for sins, and therefore you can't use anything that causes death. And that's why there are no metal implements used in building the Beis Hamikdash. However, you can't slaughter an animal without a knife. So that was the only exception to this concept of not bringing metal into the Beis Hamikdash. Malika, where you just nip the bird's neck off with your thumbnail, is in keeping with that notion of not using the things that cause sins, that cause people to kill and maim in the Beis Hamikdash. None of this is explicit in the Torah. The Torah doesn't talk about the fingernail of the Kohen, and he eats it and where it's brought, etc. But these are different clues that they're trying to tease out some lessons from this Malika process. It's a very unusual process, and I've always been puzzled with it, because you can do it in the Mikdash, but not. And I imagine that, Kahanim must be very, very careful. If the Kohen has a razor-sharp thumbnail, he's got to be careful. I mean, we use our hands all the time. He must have Band-Aids all over his hands and legs and face. If he wants to scratch an itch, and he goes like, he could probably cut his face pretty bad. And everybody else. And you got to be careful when you shake his hand, because you get this razor, and it's not short, it's fairly long. Because in order to sever the neck of the bird, not only must it be razor sharp, but it has to be long enough to, the manual dexterity required is also very great. It's interesting, though, that there are certain mitzvos that require a certain amount of ability to use parts of your body. Na'anuim on Sukkos, you have to learn how to shake a lulav. Shechita, you have to be able to have a steady hand. If a person doesn't have a steady hand, you can't be a shochet. because and you have to be able to check the knife. If you ever look at a shochet's hands, by the way, the shochet's fingernails are all scratched, because that's how you check the blade for a nick. You run the blade across your nail, and that's why shochtim always have scarred fingernails, because they're always checking their knives. And after every 1 or 2 shchitas, you have to switch knife, because it could, and most shochet have several knives, and they rotate. One shochet does the actual slaughtering, the other guy is sharpening the knives, and then your mashkiach goes around checking the knives, and that's how meat costs so much money, because the process is a very involved process. And then after you check it, you got to check the internal organs. That's another process. It's not, and this is why kosher meat is so expensive, because it goes through, it isn't, if you go to a non-kosher slaughterhouse, they'll just stun the animal or bop it on the head, and that's it. And they flay it, and there's no concern for I wouldn't say the dignity of the animal, but for the pain of the animal, or how you treat the animal, draining the blood out. Interestingly enough, by the way, when you slaughter an animal, the blood has to be drained. But pragmatically, they pour out some of the blood, then they save the rest of the blood, and it gushes out like a bucketfuls. They save it to sell to the non-kosher slaughterhouses, because the non-kosher butchers make something called blood pudding out of the blood. The blood congeals. If you leave the blood out, it congeals. It's like chocolate pudding, and they eat it. They sell the hides. They sell everything is used. At one time, even the hoofs were sold, because they used to make gelatin out of hoofs. But now it's mostly vegetarian gelatin. In any event, malika is a very special type. I wouldn't call it shchita, but it's a very special type of killing of a bird that was used for poor people who couldn't afford an animal to atone for their sins, or to bring a korban olah, a burnt offering. It's not described anywhere what it is. It simply says malakas rosha. That's all it says. Twice in last week's parsha. You do this malika on the parsha, on the neck of this dove. What the malika is, it's all part of Torah Sheba'al Peh, which is no less than what shchita is also. Shchita is based on a pasuk, v'zavachta asher tzivisicha, and that's it. Somewhere along the line, Moshe received Torah Sheba'al Peh on how to do shchita, and that's been enshrined in what we now call Yoredeya, which is a section of Shulchan Aruch. It's all Torah Sheba'al Peh. So hopefully, there's an interesting discussion that the Mashiach comes. Will there be karbanos or not? And if there will be karbanos, will it be all the karbanos or just a korban toda? We'll have to wait and see. Yeah. I don't know if it goes to halal, because halal has their own rules for shchita. Yeah, I don't think it goes to halal. It goes to the non-kosher slaughterhouses, and then they can use the animals there. Whether it's halal, I don't think so, because they have their own halachos of shechting. So if we shecht it and it's not good for us, I don't know if a halal. I don't know. I would think not. I would think not. Yeah, it goes from the back. It severs the spine of the bird first. Yeah, it has to be very, very sharp. Now, again, the spine of a bird is not that, it's not really bony. It might be more like cartilage, perhaps. I don't know. I've never done this malika on a bird. But again, you hold the legs with 2 fingers, the wings with 2 fingers, and then at the same time, the thumb has to be used somehow to cut across the back of the neck and sever the spinal column and the head of the bird. But if you look in every translation, it's different. They nip the bird. The words it's not translated. So this malika is this process which is elaborated upon in the Gemara in Zvachim and also in Chulin, for the Kohen to use his fingernail, which is a very unusual type of slaughtering of a bird, not technically called shechita, but it's called malika. So if you were paying close attention, you find that word used twice in last week's parsha. What's that?
It was not a poor people, it was a proper equipment that a lot of Kohanim had.
Well, the Kohen did all the shechting for everybody.
Right, I mean, they need a lot of Kohanim for that, or you only had a couple that's special?
Well, it depends. You had on a regular weekday, you had a certain number of Kohanim on duty. There were 24 mishmarot of Kohanim shifts throughout the year, and not all. The only time that all Kohanim were on deck is on Pesach, primarily, and then also on Yom Kippur. But primarily on Pesach because everybody was bringing the Korban Pesach. But on a regular daily basis, you didn't have that many Kohanim going on, and I guess there weren't, thousands upon thousands of people coming to bring korbanos. But if a person couldn't afford a sheep or a cow, they would bring a turtle dove, and that would suffice for their particular korban, either an olah or a chatas. That's what I wanted to share with you this morning. It's a very unusual usage in the parsha, but well, Kohanim have to have very good manual dexterity, yes, for all different types of reasons. It's a fascinating thing in last week's parsha. That's why I have to pay attention to Kriyas HaTorah. Okay.
Sign of a right.
Ushem Adonai Orach Me'atzav Yad Olam. Baruch Shechal Mishalot V'Chayinu. Amen. Ya Brisco Shatasam Tabipsa Shani. Yes, but